Hi, good morning. I am here as a member of the National Radioactive Waste Coalition and also representing the group in Albuquerque that Tim mentioned, Nuclear Issue Study Group. And as a member of that group, our organization we're really focusing on getting young people involved and trying to present the nuclear issue in plain language for people and to make it more accessible, which is one of the reasons why our national coalition is having this webinar to talk about these things and explain why we formed these principles, which I'll present in a minute. I am from the Navajo Nation. My people have been severely impacted by uranium mining, which Rose spoke about earlier. We have it's estimated 15,000 abandoned uranium mines across the country. And this is a different type of waste than Deb was explaining a minute ago. And I want to also highlight, Rose talked about WIPP. WIPP is a completely different type of waste site, which is already in New Mexico. And along with not just the uranium sites and the various multiple waste sites in New Mexico, I just want to highlight we have so many waste sites across the country, such as Hanford and other places that are severely contaminated, including the White Mesa Mill, which is also adjacent to the Navajo Nation in the Four Corners region. And I bring these areas up because these are all in places where people are still dealing with the impacts from those facilities. We're still dealing with the contamination. We're dealing with contaminated water. And as Indigenous peoples, this not only impacts our health and the environment, but our relationship to that water and how we use the water and the mountains and the places where uranium was mined and all of these nuclear sites. When they're contaminated, it affects how our people access them, collect medicines, and also the animals. And of course, we still eat these animals. So our people, our culture, and the future of our culture is irreparably damaged. So this is something, the number one priority, that the number one principle is to stop making waste. But I just want to also highlight right now, along with the principles, one of the reasons, a couple of reasons why we started to create these principles are also to highlight the principles of environmental justice and also the Hamas principles of democratic organizing. These are documents that were written a long time ago that we're striving to use as guidelines for our work. And we also promote them for other organizations to use as well. And so they inform our principles, and they also are the reasons why we are doing our work a little bit differently and more holistically. So you might think this presentation was just on high-level waste, but it's important to bring up the uranium, the front end of the nuclear fuel chain, the middle steps, as well as the back end. And so right now, one of the most important things I want to highlight is RECA. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act is something that was created in the 90s to help to provide funding to people who were affected by the United States atomic legacy, but it is not inclusive of uranium miners who worked after 1971, and it's not inclusive of a lot of people who were impacted by nuclear test sites, namely the people impacted by the Trinity site, which was the first nuclear test here in New Mexico. And so this is a bill that is going to sunset this summer, which is very important that you all know there are a lot of efforts to continue RECA. And even though the timing is not right, I'm asking that you support any efforts to make or to extend RECA now and in the future, because we need the compensation for our people and the descendants of these people who were impacted by the atomic legacy, not just the Manhattan Project, but all of these nuclear issues today. And on top of that, the Trinity site residents were never even given an apology. So the work that we're doing, it's very inclusive of the nuclear fuel chain, not just the high level waste. Okay, so I'm gonna present the principles. And a lot of our folks who are here today, we put these together because we live near these sites. So it's not just a matter of not in my backyard, especially as Indigenous peoples. We don't do these things just for ourselves, but it's really for the entire health of our Mother Earth. And then also when we think about the next generations, and you might have heard the concept 7 generations. So we look to the past, we see what has happened and here in the present, and we look 3 generations in the past and assess what's going on, and then plan for 3 generations into the future. I'm sorry, was there someone speaking? Okay, so these are the principles. There's 6 of them, and we are asking you to use these to apply them to federal policy and legislation. These are guiding principles which have to do with not just nuclear power, not just the waste from the nuclear power, but the entire nuclear fuel chain. Okay. So from all the speakers here today, we heard of all the horrible issues with nuclear waste. And the United States, as Dave presented, was trying to create some process to address the waste issue. However, the number one thing we need to do is to stop making nuclear waste. Just to backtrack a little bit, during the BRC process, the United States held national meetings, and they only held 5. I attended one in Arizona, but they did not have one in New Mexico, which is interesting, because New Mexico and Texas are the only places entertaining proposals for the temporary storage of nuclear waste. Now, the second principle is to prioritize human health and environmental protection. As you heard from all the speakers here today, this is something I know a lot about, especially with uranium cleanup. A lot of times the prioritization is on, as it says here, we need to protect the health and safety of the environment, not the nuclear industry profits and subsidies. And so we need to put funding to our people, to our environment, and not to the nuclear companies. This is very important, as well as cleanup standards that also prioritize human health, not nuclear worker health. Community health, the health of children, the health of women, and those who are the most impacted from radiation. So the next principle, acknowledge and combat environmental racism and injustice. So this is another thing where, for example, Indigenous peoples have been targeted, and almost, I'm going to use a strong word. I'm going to say Indigenous communities were bribed to take this nuclear waste. We know there's a lot of efforts that had happened in the past, and we're still dealing with this, not just at Yucca Mountain, but the sites here in New Mexico, and of course in our history. But this is something that may come up in the future. So we need to stop dumping on people of color and those who are already bearing the burden of the nuclear industry. Stop subsidizing the sources of nuclear waste. So again, we're talking about prioritizing corporations over people. And this is, again, I'm going to bring up Hanford. We put billions of dollars into Hanford every year, but how much money do we put into RECA? And RECA is going to sunset this year. This is not okay. We have our priorities backwards as a country. Communities must have the first and last word. Well, again, this is why we're speaking up today, because we have never been at the table when these decisions are made. We, as community people, especially as Indigenous peoples, we were never given free, informed, and prior consent about any of these projects. So our people, some people needed jobs and they were never told these jobs can kill them, or these jobs will kill their children when they're bringing home uranium waste on their clothes or in their lunch buckets. So today we must change that and make sure the communities, especially when we're talking about consent-based siting, as Rose said earlier, the communities did not consent to these proposals. These were for-profit corporations that went forward to create these proposals, not communities that will be impacted. And one last thing is to highlight all of the transportation communities And many of them, many have no idea that the waste is even going to go through their community, much less what are the possible impacts, which I heard one company guy tell my state officials, oh, it's no big deal. It's just like getting an X-ray. But again, we do not consent. We do not consent to these temporary sites. We do not consent to making more waste. We do not consent to these so-called harmless X-rays. This method, the ways our country works to protect industry needs to change, and you all can help to do that, to make sure organizations like ours and individuals and people like Rose and Deb and Dave and others who are working on these issues are heard and included at the decision-making table. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Leona, and thanks to all of our presenters. And again, if you have a question, you can put that in the chat and we'll get to it as soon as we can. We're going to start with a question. I think this is mostly for Rose and Leona, but I think you know, if Deb or Dave want to comment on it as well, that's fine. But you know, you've sort of, you know, I guess maybe what's wrong with the idea of consent-based siting? I mean, I think to most people it kind of sounds like the way that these things should be done. But you know, but you've both been involved in the processes that DOE has been, you know, going through the last few years, and so kind of can you give us a sense of, you know, what's wrong with the way that this is being done?
Tim, this Rose. The thing that's wrong with it is that there is no outreach to get consent from me or the regular folks. These companies come to the area and they'll give one big briefing and tell and spout all the good things about themselves. They allow you a little time to speak. You're limited to what, 2, 3, 4 minutes. And then it's on to the next person. But these meetings are so crowded with industry professionals that they take up the majority of the time spent promoting these same companies, and not enough time giving the regular guy a chance to say no. And they don't take no. It's like, well, that's irrelevant. You don't really get a vote. So that's what is wrong. And I'm not sure that there's a remedy for it because they're not coming to my home. Holtec has never been to Eunice. Holtec went to Hobbs, but they never came to see us. And we're just as impacted as any other member of this state. Maybe Leona would like to add more.
Yes, sorry. I would like to highlight, actually, if I could share my screen again, I want to highlight the way that the NRC in particular has dealt with these issues. This consent-based siting process that took place a few years ago, like I mentioned, there was only 5 meetings across the country. And I happened to be available to attend a meeting in another state that took a lot of energy to attend. It cost a lot of money. It took a lot of time. And so it was not accessible to, you know, people that are in impacted communities, meaning it was not in a place that actually is going to probably, you know, that at the time we knew Holtec and WCS were sites that were at risk, and we knew that we were being threatened, yet these meetings were not held in our communities. So that's the number one thing that's wrong with this process is you can call something anything you want, but that doesn't mean that's what it really is. And the way they did it was not equitable. I'm showing this image. The reason why I'm showing this image is because as a Diné person, this here is what we call the Navajo Nation, this orange splotch here. However, my people, we believe this is our homeland, which is within the 4 sacred mountains. Now, if you look at this green line, this is one of the rail lines that goes from the, you know, from east to west and whatever, west to east. it's the main rail line that goes through the northern part of our state. And we imagine the transportation of the waste can take any route. We don't know the route. Well, we won't know until it's actually moving. I think 4 days is the amount of time that people are given, which is not enough time when you're talking about one of the biggest concerns when we're talking about transportation through the reservation is people have animals. There's a language barrier. And so when the Holtec applied, this is Holtec applied for a consolidated interim storage license here, very close to Rose's home, even though it's on the other side of the state. When they applied, the NRC sent 11 letters nationally to the tribes they thought were going to be impacted. There's over 575 federally recognized tribes. There's more tribes that are not recognized by the federal government. So there's hundreds of indigenous nations that were not notified. And this is just one. My nation is along the railroads, and we happen to have 2 sacred mountains. So this is an issue for me that's very personal because of the cultural impact. But the fact that the NRC only sent 11 letters, and on top of that, our people as indigenous nations require a different way of government to government communications, and that has never been respected. We have a council, we have a calendar. The NRC and Holtec has never come to my council to present any of these proposals. They have never invited in person to my people, you know, with a translator, you know, to be a part of the consolidated interim, I'm sorry, to be a part of the consent-based siting process. So this is an issue that from the root of it is inherently racist, and we need to stop it. So I'm gonna just stop talking now and stop sharing this with you.
Great, thank you, Leona.